Massive thanks to one of my YouTube viewers, Space Alien Jesus, for telling me about this topic for this week's video. And like always, if you think there is an extreme story relating to extreme music and you think it needs to be told on this channel and you want a shout out, definitely let me know in the comments. Now, with that being stated, the person in question for this video is all about Jim Sullivan, a singer-songwriter that plays in a style that's a mixture between country, folk rock, and psychedelic rock to some extent. So it has nothing pertaining to extreme music, but his story and mystery is so outlandish that it sounds like something out of an episode of The X-Files or Twilight Zone that I just could not pass up talking about this. For those who are unaware of the story of Jim Sullivan, he was born August 13th, 1939 in Nebraska, but later on relocated with his family to San Diego, California during World War II. During his adolescent and teenage years, he found a strong fascination playing guitar. Roughly around the time when he was finishing high school, he met his then future wife, Barbara, who he would end up marrying in 1960, roughly around the age of either 20 or 21. From all articles and accounts you can read online discussing the biography of Jim Sullivan, it always states that he was way more of a easygoing person that wasn't so much head helm on like business and finances. An example of that can be shortly after starting college, he co-owned a bar which ended in a financial disaster. And that he was way more motivated on becoming a musician, a singer-songwriter. Creating music was his true passion. And while he absolutely had the talent to create music, as we'll be discussing later on in this video, his real dilemma is that he never had really any connections. However, this is where his wife Barbara truly helps him out. From what you can find online, the earliest music that Jim Sullivan was a part of was a 1966 folk rock band called The Survivors, who only released one 7-inch consisting of 2 songs, that being Midnight Mines and Quoth the Raven. What's interesting to note here is that it credits that Jim Sullivan wrote all the music for this band. However, where this comes into play for his wife Barbara really benefiting Jim here is that when it comes to the vocalist for this band, The Survivors, that would be Kathy Steely, who is Barbara's sister, aka Jim Sullivan's sister-in-law. As for the music of this demo, there's not much to state here as it only contains 2 songs. Both tracks roughly equal out to 2.5 minutes long, so there's only 5 minutes of material on this. And while it's credited that, again, Jim Sullivan wrote all the music, he's only providing vocals on one of the 2 tracks, that being Quoth of the Raven. But what's interesting really to point out here as well is that this is Jim Sullivan's first true start getting into the music world. The Survivors wouldn't amalgamate to anything because 2 years later in 1968, Jim Sullivan and his wife Barbara would then relocate to Los Angeles, California. From my understanding, there are 2 huge key factors as to why they moved to Los Angeles. One being the fact that it's a hot spot for anything and everything that has to do with high profile people, whether it be celebrities, movie stars, and musicians, and I mean still to this day it is. And the other key component being the fact that his wife Barbara ended up landing a job as a secretary for Capitol Records. Just in case some of you aren't aware, Capitol Records during the 1960s was a humongous label that was putting out albums for bands like the Beatles and the Beach Boys. You would think with Barbara working there as a secretary, it would help get Jim Sullivan, who is a singer-songwriter, have a one-way ticket shot to get himself signed to Capitol Records and put out music. However, all attempts were unsuccessful. Though he never landed a contract with Capitol Records, what he did landing correctly are the right notes with the local people around LA, as he would do evening and night shows performing at a bar called The Raft. From all accounts, it seemed that every time Jim would perform at The Raft, the venue would be packed to the gills, people coming in droves and overpacking the place just to hear him perform his music, which is already impressive enough to start a fan base without even being signed to a record label. But what's really interesting is that some of those fans were celebrities around the area, such as Harry Dean Stanton and even Dennis Hopper. Thanks to his connections with the actors and celebrities in the Los Angeles area, he was able to land some small-time movie roles, believe it or not. Most notably, he had a cameo in the counterculture film Easy Rider, which I'll be talking about this cameo a little bit more later on in this video, along with landing a small-time part, even playing his own music in a low-budget neo-noir crime thriller called The Pickup. But what really got Jim Sullivan on the map to start releasing music is, although he had many failed attempts to be signed to Capitol Records, more and more actors of the surrounding area of Los Angeles became aware of his presence, one of which being Al Dubs, who heard him play at the Raft and thought he deserved to get his own label. Thus, he ended up raising money and opened up his own record label, that being Monty Records, solely to sign Jim Sullivan. With him now being signed to a label, having extra funds, and getting a full band together, all session guest musicians from the Wrecking Crew, they would end up releasing an album in 1969 titled UFO. In terms of musical styles, it's played in the mixture between folk rock, psychedelic folk, and psychedelic rock. It contains 10 songs, and its overall runtime is a little under 30 minutes, so it's pretty short. The lyrical themes on this album have to do with the mysterious nature of extraterrestrial, to being on the highway driving through, which I'm pretty sure that has to do with his relationship with the cameo with Easy Rider, along with the vast empty landscape of the desert. One thing I find really interesting about this album at face value is the album title, UFO. Again, this was released in 1969, and the term UFO, which obviously stands for Unidentified Flying Object, wasn't a term that wasn't recently used up until the 1950s, more specifically 1953. So that term was still fairly new during its time, that if you were to search up the first ever album to use the term UFO, whether it be an album title or a song title, Jim Sullivan's debut full-length album is one of the first ever to do it. But I'm getting a little bit too ahead of myself here depicting some of the lyrics on this album. Overall, musically and from my own personal enjoyment with it, I think this album is great, and maybe it's just because I'm a handful of generations past the original release of this album, but it's mixture between psychedelic folk, psychedelic rock. It will just sweep you off your feet, especially when it comes to Jim's singing. His voice is really masculine, but at the same time easygoing, that melds perfectly with his guitar playing, all done by a 12-string guitar. My personal favorite song on this album musically would easily go to the song Rosie. Even though lyrically it has nothing to do with the main components of this album of like extraterrestrials or the desert or the highway, it has to do with a woman falling in love with two different men, one rich and one poor. What I just love about it musically is just how climactic the string arrangements and the composition flows throughout the song, that the outro portion of it is just absolutely gorgeous. Again, of a blend of psychedelic folk, psychedelic rock, and even neoclassical moments, again with how the string arrangements are, that is just a wonderful song that needs to be heard. Without question, the fan favorite song on this album would easily go to the title track, UFO. What's really impressive about it musically is that it's only 2 minutes and 50 seconds long, yet it sounds substantially longer because you're going on this odyssey trip and this intergalactic level, basically, as all of these psychedelic rock sound effects that come and go throughout it, it gets so lush and trippy that it almost leans into like surrealist territory. Other great tracks worth checking out would be Highways, Plain as Your Eyes Can See, and So Natural. Over the years, this album has received more recognition and positive feedback, both by fans and critics, mainly having to do with the fact that it's connected to the story of Jim Sullivan. That being said, during its time in 1969, this album was a commercial failure. A few reasons as to why that might be is one being the fact that this album was put out through a small independent label, so any form of advertising wasn't attached to it. Add to the fact, as talented as Jim Sullivan was, he was a singer-songwriter in Los Angeles during the late 60s. There was basically a dime a dozen out there. Regardless, before I go any further, and I'll probably say it again later on in this video, but I'll state it here now, definitely check this album out if you're interested in folk rock or psychedelic folk rock or psychedelic rock, as I think this album is great, and it's pretty cool to know that this album has been repressed throughout the years, so it's pretty easy to find online. Even though the album UFO was a commercial failure, it didn't impact Jim Sullivan's ambitions to write or create music. However, I do believe what it did impact on him was mentally and emotionally, he started coping with this by developing a drinking habit. According to articles online about Jim Sullivan and his relationship with alcohol, is that it's always been a part of his life. I mean, again, he's a singer-songwriter playing in bars and partying, so obviously it's always been a part of his, just, I guess, diet in this case. It's just after the release of UFO, it started becoming a bit more excessive as he was starting becoming more of like an alcoholic. He would end up giving music another shot, because 3 years later in 1972, he would release his second full-length album. This album would end up being put out by Playboy Records, owned by Hugh Hefner. Yep, the Hugh Hefner who owns Playboy. Apparently during the 50s up into the late 70s, he had his own record label that signed numerous amounts of singer-songwriters and pop artists, and Jim Sullivan just happened to be one of them. This album is a bit different from the previous album, UFO. Even though it still has the same attitude from the previous album of Jim Sullivan's really easygoing vocal approach and just presentation that he has musically, what's different about it, for one, is in terms of styles, it's not done in the sense of psychedelic folk rock, but more so being played in the style of country rock. Lyrically, it's nowhere as adventurous as UFO either, as it's a juxtaposition between someone sounding very hopeless and full of regret, but also wishing for a better future. One way I could describe this album with just its overall sound is it just feels like an album where Jim is trying to just cope with the fact that all of his ambitions that he was working towards just really didn't lead to much in terms of, commercial success and overall critical acclaim, and this album is like the fallout of those emotions. That being said, there are portions on this album where he jams out. Best example I can give you, and easily the standout track on here, would be Biblical Boogie, which I know is kind of a funny song title, but again, this is 1972 when it was released. And just the overall track, they just jam out so hard for country rock standards that it was a load of fun to listen to, and it kind of leans almost into funk territory, at least when it comes to the percussions, that I would highly recommend starting off with this song if you want to get some enjoyment with this album. Another catchy tune on this album would be You Show Me the Way to Go, which puts more emphasis on choirs, and it becomes a bit more infectious and catchy compared to most of the songs that he wrote. But other than cherry picking those two particular songs, the rest of the album is still very pessimistic, especially when you listen to songs like Don't Let It Throw You, Lonesome Picker, and I'll Be Here. Personally, I wouldn't say this is a bad album. It's more of an album that you would listen to after a really rough day at work. You want to grab a beer and just sulk and just how difficult the day was, and have an album that at least resembles or relates to you in some sense, showcasing that you've had a difficult time, but at least you want something better out of life. That being said, what's really uncharacteristic about all of this, at least when you know about Jim Sullivan, is that in some interviews when it comes to his family members, more particularly his son, Chris Sullivan, stating the fact that he knew his dad to be very charismatic, electric, that he had a really magnetic personality to him, that if you knew of him, you heard him talk or perform, you just want to gravitate towards him and hear him more. Whereas on this album, Jim sounds really reclusive now in some sense, so clearly something is very off with him. Even though he's signed to a larger label, that being Playboy Records out of all things, this album would still end up being a commercial failure. And once again, Jim Sullivan was back to square one, really just trying to figure out how he can make it big in the music world. After numerous failed attempts to make it big in the Los Angeles music scene, Jim Sullivan decided that he alone would relocate to Nashville, Tennessee in March of 1975. And this is the part of the story where things get really, really weird. From all accounts and articles documenting Jim Sullivan is that he left on March 4th, 1975 from LA alone in his own Volkswagen Beetle. By doing so, traveling alone, he did leave his family behind in Los Angeles with his wife and 2 kids. It's just he did that so he could support them financially going to Nashville, Tennessee, as it makes sense considering the fact that Nashville, Tennessee is widely considered to be the capital of country music. That being said, it goes without saying that anyone who lives in the United States knows that this country is pretty large in terms of landmass. And traveling by car from Los Angeles to Nashville would take roughly around 29 hours straight of driving, or 2,000 miles apart, so it's quite the lengthy journey. Now, to put Barbara's mind at ease if Jim were to partake in such a lengthy journey, she wanted him to call her every day at least once, whether it be a rest stop or a payphone that he stops by, to ensure her that everything's going well with this journey. That's a promise that Jim would keep, only just one single time. Because on March 5th, 1975, this would be the last time that Jim and his wife Barbara would ever speak to each other. As the phone call goes between Barbara and Jim, is that apparently he called her in Santa Rosa, New Mexico on a payphone, stating that he's in New Mexico, that he's trying to get to Nashville, Tennessee, and that, he's been doing a lot of driving. But to Barbara, he seemed a little bit off and odd. And when she pressed on the question if anything's wrong, Jim replied with, "You wouldn't believe it if I told you." From there, Barbara pressed on more of a question as to what do you mean by that? And Jim just simply replied with, "Forget it, forget I said anything," and that he'll tell her all about it when he gets to Nashville, Tennessee. And again, that was the last time they ever spoke to each other. Later on the same day of March 5th, Jim Sullivan would end up being pulled over by law enforcement as he was weaving and swerving driving on the highway. Police had been suspicious that he may have been intoxicated or drunk driving. From there, they gave him a sobriety test where he ended up passing it. It's highly speculated as to why he was weaving and swerving on the highway wasn't because he was intoxicated, but more so having to do with the fact that he had been exhausted. Presumably he had been driving for 15 hours at that point. From there, he ended up checking into a motel in Santa Rosa, that being the La Mesa Motel. Although he got his room key, he never ended up staying the night or getting any rest, as supposedly, by some eyewitness reports, he immediately left to go to a liquor store, buy a bottle of vodka, and continue on driving. Then, a day later on March 6, 1975, this would supposedly be the last ever sighting of Jim Sullivan, as 26 miles south of Santa Rosa, his car would ended up breaking down. The people who saw him owned the property of the ranch of where his car broke down by the Giannetti family, asking him if he was alright, he needed any help, and that he was taking care of things, and the last thing they saw of him is him walking away from his car. And, well, that was the last time anyone ever saw Jim Sullivan. Which of course now begs the question, what happened to him? There are a lot of theories out there, and I'm going to talk about the ones that are mainly brought up, starting with the police. Obviously, with him not making any contact with his wife and friends and family being worried, shortly after his disappearance they put out a missing persons report on him, and the search went on for a handful of days. Police located his car to find that it had been completely abandoned. The car did break down as the engine completely did not work. What they did find in the car was all of Jim's personal belongings, such as his wallet, 12-string guitar, and copies of his albums in the back seat and trunk of it. For roughly 2 weeks, police and even the Sullivan's family ended up aiding in the search for Jim Sullivan, searching all around the area to even parts of the New Mexico desert, but nothing came to success. However, what did end up happening is on the end of March, investigators found a decomposing body that, in terms of their physique and appearance, strikingly resembled that of Jim Sullivan, only later to be revealed after an autopsy report that it wasn't him. But what's very odd about this body that they found, it was only 8 miles west of the last known sighting of Jim Sullivan. From what I was able to gather, that's all the efforts from police and investigators. Now, this is where people start theorizing that there's some foul play to be had here, since we still don't have answers, at least on the police end. Because way earlier on in this video, I talked about that Jim was in a cameo spot to the film Easy Rider. Well, Easy Rider is often considered to be, for its time in the late 60s, a counterculture film that portrayed, bikers and that free life and being very anti-authoritarian, kind of portraying, again, investigators, police, or anyone in that department to be kind of dim-witted and foolish. So, it's heavily theorized on the police end by fans and people who look into this that there was some foul play by the police, because when they pulled him over a day before on March 5th, 1975, people speculate that even though he passed the sobriety test, maybe there was some exchange verbally that people by the police didn't really care for, or that they noticed it was Jim Sullivan, him being a part of that film, and it rubbed off on the police in some wrong way, that they want to get some retribution by taking his life and then burying his body in the desert somewhere. Personally, I don't really buy into that theory, not because I'm trying to defend police or anything in this sense, but that seems like such a stretch to notice one guy who only had a cameo spot in a film 6 years prior to the events that happened to pull off something like that. Again, we don't know all the details in terms of the exchange that those police and Jim had, but that just seems like such a stretch to assume something that diabolical would happen. But even so, because of that, when they discovered a body that resembles Jim Sullivan shortly after his disappearance, maybe that was actually him, but since they wanted to cover up their traces and steps, the police department once again kind of swept it under the rug, stating, oh, that's actually not him, it just looks like him. Again, it just seems like such a stretch for a conspiracy theory that Jim Sullivan disappeared or lost his life because of being in a cameo spot in a counterculture film 6 years prior and the police wanted retribution. It seems like such a stretch. The other conspiracy theory, and this is what led to me making this video, is that people truly believe that Jim Sullivan was abducted by aliens. I mean, without a doubt, this is the most outlandish theory that people will always bring up when talking about the disappearance of him. But when you look at all the components and things having to do with his music, there's a lot of really odd coincidences. Obviously, people will point towards his debut full-length album, UFO, with the title song, that a lot of people heavily speculate because of that song, its lyrical themes, that it somehow predicts and foreshadows his destiny of him being abducted by aliens. Most particular, the lyrical verse that goes, "I'm checking out the show with a glassy eye, looking at the sun dancing through the sky. Did he come by UFO?" Then there's the phone call, or the last ever conversation that he had with his wife. It's really eerie that he would state to her, stating, "Oh, you wouldn't believe it if I told you," only for her to ask and put pressure on that question for him just not to answer, stating he'll tell her all about it when he gets to Nashville, Tennessee, making this extremely ominous and making everyone who looks into this case very suspicious as to what he was referring to. The last bit of information that I want to plug in regarding towards UFO, aliens, and abductions is this is a bit more recent of a study, but according to some studies, towards the year of 2000 to present day, the states that get the most UFO sightings just so happen to be California and New Mexico, which I know this is kind of comparing apples to oranges from seeing a UFO in the sky to getting abducted by aliens, but kind of a strange coincidence here towards this story. Along with the fact, if you take into consideration that when it came to Jim's disappearance, there was no trace of it in terms of where he went, and his body is still missing to this day, people still heavily speculate that, again, he was abducted by aliens and just went off into outer space. The alien abduction theory, without doubt, is the most outlandish, and in terms of getting people's attention and wondering what happened to Jim Sullivan, it definitely creates conversation. I am guilty of it. I only really know of this because of it being related to alien abduction. But looking at this in a way more realistic sense, there's other theories out there that come off, more believable. But again, when you start connecting all of these components with the story of Jim Sullivan, his music, and how he disappeared, yeah, there's a lot of strange coincidences. But again, looking at this in a more realistic sense, it's highly, highly, highly doubtful that this ended up being the case. The third theory is that Jim Sullivan was murdered by the Mafia. How this comes into play is that when his car broke down, it was on a ranch owned by the Giannetti family. People heavily speculate that the Giannetti family was part of the Mafia, and that not so much his car broke down, but it came off like Jim Sullivan was trespassing on their property, and knowing that he's a really charismatic person that likes to talk to people, people assume that there was some verbal exchange and the Giannetti family didn't like it, so they ended up putting a hit on him when he walked away from his car. Along with the fact that after all the investigation was done trying to find Jim Sullivan, that the Giannetti family shortly after moved to Hawaii. To be honest with you guys, I find the alien abduction theory more believable than the Mafia theory for so many reasons. For one, if they put a hit on Jim Sullivan, let's say they did, they're part of the Mafia, the last thing they would do is leave even a speck of evidence behind. Because why would his car still be there on their ranch with all of his belongings? That makes absolutely no sense in terms of the mentality of how the Mafia operates. And the connection that they moved to Hawaii shortly after the investigation, it's like, yeah, people move. The last and honestly most believable theory that more than likely is what ended up happening, sadly is the most depressing to think about. Because during this point, at least we can see with the history of Jim Sullivan's musical career, is that he was struggling financially just to find any sort of success in the music business, seeming as if going to Nashville, Tennessee was like his last real attempt to collect any sort of money, fame, or success from doing music. At the same time, too, he's starting to drink a lot more and becoming an alcoholic, and this, to a lot of people, seems to be like his last real attempt to get his life on track. And according to some reports by his own son, that being Chris Sullivan, is what he remembers about his father growing up is that Jim was always consistent on trying to make music. He was talking about music, he was playing his music around the house, that Chris growing up kind of got sick of always hearing it. He seemed as if his father was like almost obsessed or like overly determined to make music, that even after his father's disappearance, he really didn't even want to hear any of his father's music, only for decades later to finally start enjoying it. Which really only just drives it home even further that Jim is really on his last wit's ends to make something of his musical career. So traveling alone from Los Angeles to Nashville, Tennessee, is he did an extensive amount of driving. Even on his first day, roughly averaging around 15 hours of just non-stop driving. And while his sobriety test when he got pulled over, he passed, it still doesn't change the fact that during that time, he was just doing a lot more drinking. Add to the fact with the New Mexico heat and the desert heat, more than likely this man was very dehydrated and disoriented, thus his mentality was really damaged. Along with the fact when you take into consideration that on March 5th, he ended up going to a motel only to then go to a liquor store and buy a bottle of vodka, I can only assume it got even worse for his mental health. What gets even extremely suspicious is apparently by the Rodeo magazine that did a report on Jim Sullivan, is that a few months prior from his road trip to Nashville, Tennessee, Jim and his manager had a late night conversation, and it ended up with his manager asking, "Jim, how would you like to disappear?" Where Jim replied with, "I'd walk into the desert and never come back." To be honest, more than likely that's what happened. Jim's voluntarily just walked into the desert after just a mental breakdown, basically, From failing at least commercially anyway, with his musical career, to driving through New Mexico for his car to then break down, I think there was nothing more for him to do but just basically give up, it seems, and he just walked into the desert and life took it from there. I mean, why else would he leave behind his music, his wallet, and even his own 12-string guitar, which are really expensive, by the way, and something that he played with ever since he basically started writing and creating music? It just seems like the only thing that makes sense here. But that's the thing. We'll never know. Because over 50 years later to this day, Jim Sullivan is still missing. As for the legacy he left behind, mainly having to do with the fact that of his disappearance and story, even though he only released 2 full-length albums over 50 years ago, people like myself find a lot of interest with his disappearance and how it correlates with his music. But even so, after all this time, I think people are just enjoying the music that he did create, as it's become easier to obtain, as there's been a lot more represses over the years, and it just sparks a lot of interest and conversation about how it relates with his story to the overall music he was creating, of just, again, really awesome psychedelic folk rock of his time. Thanks to the internet sparking all new interest and conversation for Jim Sullivan's music, as of recently, as of 2019, a label called The Light in the Attic would end up putting out an LP titled If the Evening Were Dawn. It's a compilation of all of his unreleased material and demos that of songs he did from the previous albums, but it's just his vocals and his 12-string guitar were done in a minimalistic approach. That what's really interesting is the album artwork they chose for this release is this silhouette figure of a man in the desert with footprints leading up to him. It's also worth mentioning with Light in the Attic on their YouTube channel, they would have a short 5-minute documentary of Jim Sullivan, even interviewing his wife Barbara. For my closing remarks with this video, I'll state that I am one of the many people here on YouTube alone that has done a video all about Jim Sullivan. There's so many videos, threads, forums, and conversation pieces out there relating to this man, solely having to do with his disappearance and how it relates to his music, that maybe it's just the mystique of his disappearance or how it relates to his music that kind of gets into these weird, trippy, psychedelic, surrealist-like ideas with lyrical themes for their time in the late 60s. It just seems like something out of the Twilight Zone. It seems like something out of an episode of X-Files that leaves a lot of wonder and desire to just understand how something like this happens. That overall, even though his story is extremely interesting in terms of the more of the, cold case side of things, his music is awesome. I plan on buying it at some point because honestly, UFO, it is such a wonderful album if you're a fan of psychedelic folk and psychedelic rock. It's a great album overall. But definitely look into this if you want a rabbit hole of just a mystery in terms of music. This is definitely out there as one of the wildest stories I've come across thus far. And that'll do it for this video, guys. Like always, links provided to everything I talked about will be in the description below. Really curious to know what you think should be covered next on my channel. Like always, guys, make sure you guys drink plenty of water to stay hydrated, and have a great day.